Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by our Head of UX here at Nomensa, Joe Knowles. This webinar is called Facing Adversity, How to Cultivate Individual and Organisational Resilience. In this talk, Joe is going to explore resilience from both a human and a corporate perspective so that we can better understand how to thrive as designers and as people. Joe will explore what forms resilience and ask, how does resilience apply to both the individual and the company, and what resilience means for you in design and as designers. Please do get involved and say hello to each other in the chat. Just make sure you switched your chat settings to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any issues with the stream as we're going along. As always, ask lots of questions using the Q&A function. I'll be asking these to Joe at the end, and I'll try and get through as many as I can. We'll also be sharing the recording with you all as soon as we can after the session today. Finally, we're using auto-generated closed captions, and whilst these are quite accurate, it does sometimes get a few words muddled. So when we make this session publicly available on our YouTube channel, we'll ensure these are 100% accurate, so just bear with us on this for the time being. So without further ado, I will hand over to Joe to kick things off.
Thanks. Maurice Herzog, swallowing the last of his food, condensed milk, if you can call that food, threw the empty packet down onto the summit of Annapurna. And this was about the only memorial he could leave as he trailed behind Louis Lachenal down the mountain and into the gathering storm. Herzog said afterwards, "Never have I felt happiness like this, so intense and pure." And this is Annapurna. It's the one at the back right. Climbing it was some achievement. Most people know that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world. K2 is the second tallest. Annapurna is actually the 10th. But this expedition marked the first time that anyone had climbed a mountain over 8,000 meters tall, of which there are only 14. And Annapurna is often considered one of the most dangerous to climb. And in 1950, when they climbed it, not only did they have to get to the top, but they also had to do all the reconnaissance as well. So they initially planned to climb a slightly taller mountain nearby, but the maps they had were from the 1920s. They had rivers and peaks and all sorts of things, valleys, whole valleys in the wrong place. And so you can imagine the vast scale of this landscape as they're walking around, trying to find the right mountain, trying to find the right place to approach it, and then actually trying to get to the top. They had to overcome setback after setback. But having set out on the 30th of March, they summited Annapurna on the 3rd of June. And as I said, it was a massive achievement. And it was one that would have huge consequences for both those who summited. Meanwhile, around about the same time, far from Annapurna, a certain company was about to release Peter Pan. And this was actually recorded as a live action film with actors and a pre-recorded dialogue, which blew my mind a little bit when I found out about that. I assumed that animators would just be doing drawing and then putting it all together, but that's how they did it then. And what's interesting is not the fact that they did it that way and that the technology has changed over time. It's the change in general. And the only consistency with Disney seems to be how they've overcome relentless change and setbacks. To exist since 1923, you would have had to come through quite a lot. They created Mickey Mouse in 1928, which was great for them. And but soon afterwards, there was the Great Depression. In 1966, Walt Disney died. In the 70s and 80s, there was so much focus on the theme parks that Walt Disney Productions became really vulnerable, and there was a hostile takeover attempt in 1984. And in 2001, of course, it was 9/11, which had a huge impact on the organization as well. Now, though, they have something like 220,000 employees. It's worth an extraordinary amount. It's an extraordinary company to have lasted so long. And I think at least some of that is down to resilience. So it's through my fascination in mountaineering and how people manage to push themselves through setbacks to continue to achieve things that I came to resilience. It's a huge topic recently, particularly with the pandemic, and been used a bit of a buzzword. But there's been so many setbacks recently, particularly, that I often wonder how people manage to keep going as individuals. And that led me to organisational resilience. So what makes one company more able to respond to setbacks over others? How can some companies thrive while others perish in the same circumstances, often in the same sectors? And then finally, what's the overlap between the two? So if you filled an organization with resilient people, would that organization be more likely to overcome setbacks? Or can an organization be resilient when there's no one in that organization that you could describe as resilient? And you might wonder what it's got to do with design, but the answer is everything. It applies to everyone and everything. Furthermore, I think in design, you need a lot of resilience because it's healthy to get setbacks. People say, don't be too precious about your work. Critique your design, put it in front of users, as you're crying into your lilt as they can't find the button that you put there right in front of them. I think that forging a successful career requires resilience, and being a great designer requires resilience. So, what is it? Some people think that it's kind of like a miracle drug personality trait that cures all. They define it thus in Psychology Today. And it's got many definitions depending on the branch of engineering, ecology, or system science doing the defining. But it's the last sentence that I saw in most places. It's the ability to rise from the ashes. It's the ability to bounce back. Unfortunately for me and many people my age, bouncing back immediately made me think of this guy. But it's the ability to recover strength, spirits, good humor, or any other aspect quickly. And it's about responding, not reacting, and being in control and accepting that bad things are going to happen. Resilience helps you deal with them. But how do you court it and recognize it? How do you develop it so that you're more able to bounce back yourself? Firstly, there's trying to understand it and recognize it. So I think the first thing to say about resilience that I uncovered is that people really only realize they've had it after the event. So people don't describe themselves necessarily as resilient. It's not a tool that's actively used, when the pressure's on and there's a huge setback and you turn around to everyone and say, don't worry, guys, we'll just be really resilient. It just doesn't happen like that. It's something that people realize they've used afterwards, a skill so ingrained in you, you don't know you've used it. Herzog wouldn't have described himself as resilient, but there's no doubt he was. And I think, any designers who are listening will be able to look back at the beginning of their career and see that actually they're a lot more resilient now than they were then, and that they've developed that over time. You can think about how you reacted to certain things when you first started out, criticism, for example, versus how you react to it now. It's probably quite different. So the next big factor that both organizations and individuals need is a large dose of reality for resilience. So facing reality, really facing it, is grueling work. It can be unpleasant and it's often emotionally wrenching. In individuals, this is like self-awareness through reflection and feedback. For Herzog on Annapurna, this was about seeking input from his teammates, responding to the mountain and the weather and all of the other different things going on, but it was about being really brutally honest about what they were facing. It wasn't about sugarcoating anything or pretending that there wasn't a monsoon about to arrive. They had to be really, really honest with what was going on. So facing up to reality is really key. For organizations, this is probably more about understanding the market. So what the organization is doing, what its key strategies are, how the market is moving and trends. So for Disney, this is about keeping an eye, an ear on the market and responding to it. And then innovating and building the technology where possible to try and be ahead of the curve. For both individuals and organizations, having a mission or a purpose is key to resilience. So some kind of meaning that goes beyond, is greater than the individual, greater than the organization, which could be reflected in values, stated or otherwise. And that can be anything. That can be climbing a big mountain or capturing market share or doing something new. I think for designers, they often talk about doing the best thing for users. And some people, it's even more than that. It's about trying to change the world for the better. The mission of the Walt Disney Company is to entertain, inform, and inspire people around the globe through the power of unparalleled storytelling, reflecting the iconic brands, creative minds, and innovative technologies that make ours the world's premier entertainment company. And if you look at all the different things that they do, that mission kind of fits all of it. The next one is improvising. So the ability to improvise is familiar to individuals and organizations. Being adaptable and being flexible. So if you're climbing a mountain and the weather changes, that's a big deal, and you'll need to come up with a new plan. Or if you come across, especially if you're going there for the first time and no one's been there, if you come across something that seems insurmountable, then you need to find a way around it. Likewise, if a pandemic comes along, or if your founder dies or anything like that, then you need to be able to respond to that. And I think tied into that is open-mindedness. So being open-minded to possibilities that others might have already written off. So the temptation is to simplify things and reduce the amount that we hold in our heads. It's easier that way. But creativity is about putting things from disparate areas together to find new solutions. And that's difficult to do if you've dismissed certain solutions. There might be something in something you've dismissed, a kernel of something that you can put somewhere else that actually helps you overcome a setback. So being open-minded is important. And then we come to the next two, which I think are the really big ones. The first one is competency. And this is going to sound really obvious, I think, because you can respond to the market better as an organization if you've got the skills to uncover and act on insight. The ability to adapt processes and ways of thinking will have the same effect. And it's the same for an individual. Certainly, Annapurna was climbable because they were capable mountaineers. It wasn't because, it wasn't like I could create a mission and decide that I'm going to climb Annapurna. I don't have any of the skills required to do it. So competency is really important. And then I think tied into that is collaboration. So extracting from others what you don't have in yourself and putting capability together from all sorts of places to the common good around that common mission. Disney wouldn't have succeeded by having rigid, immovable silos. And I think when it came to climbing Annapurna, there was also a huge amount of collaboration that had to take place in order to get to the top. And then what I did was I started to look what's specific to individuals, because there's a lot of things there that are common to individuals and organizations, but I had a bit of a deeper look into individuals. So what keeps someone at one organization for 50 years? It doesn't happen that often as much anymore, but certainly there was one place I worked where there were people there who were just about to retire, who had started in their 20s. So the first thing is optimism that I came to, which makes some sense, which is about having a positive outlook that things are going to turn out well. And that can then sustain you through setbacks, but it does work in another way. So I came across a story about someone who survived a prison camp during World War II. And they were asked, who were the people that suffered the most? Who were the people that died first? And they said, oh, that's easy, it's the optimists. And the problem was with the optimists was that they were hanging their hopes on getting out in a month or getting out by Christmas, and building it up so much in their mind that it became just such a huge setback that they just couldn't keep overcoming it. It was built up into such a thing that was then just dashed, and then they did it again and it just wore them down completely. So I think whether optimism works for you will be down to the individual. I suspect that there are extremes, and being sort of extremely optimistic is probably quite damaging in certain situations. Positive thinking is probably a better way to think about it. So this isn't necessarily thinking that everything's going to turn out well, but it's thinking that maybe something good can come out of it regardless. So there was another story about someone again who survived a prisoner of war camp. And what he was doing was he wasn't thinking, I'm going to get out. He was just thinking, I'm going to remember everything. And when this is all over, I'm going to use it to do lectures and to teach people how to make sure this never happens again. So it wasn't like he was thinking it was going to go brilliantly, but he was thinking that he might try and get a positive outcome out of it. Another one's humor. So making light of the situation at hand as if it's part of some cruel game. This has been described as the plastic shield, which people use as a barrier to protect themselves. So you see this a lot in services humor. So in the army and the navy, there are situations, if you read books about or see anything about the services, they always seem to find themselves in some terrible situation and someone will make some joke, which just seems really inappropriate, but actually it's the humor which helps protect them and get them through and bring them together, through some pretty tough moments. There's also competitiveness. as an individual. Wanting to out-survive others could make you more resilient. If your mission is to be the first to climb a mountain, then being, that element of competitiveness may well help you overcome your setbacks. Perspective is another one. So putting things in context and not just thinking that, this setback is really important. I think as designers, again, if you look back, you'll probably realize that when you were first had knockbacks, you found it really, really difficult and thought it was the end of the world. But actually, over time, you come to realize that, it's not that important. You've got the context that kind of helps you realize that it's not the end of the world if this one little thing didn't go perfectly. Curiosity has also been suggested as another one to help you become more resilient, to keep you going because you're interested in finding out. And then the final one is social support. So finding resilience in a greater connected group that doesn't rely on you solely as the person going through the setback. And I suppose as a final point to all of that, there's quite a lot of different things that I've covered there. It requires practice. So you might stumble into becoming very resilient, but you can help yourself by reflecting and practicing. So practicing being open-minded, practicing reflection and refining your mission and getting closer to reality. So resilience sounds great, doesn't it? It sounds really good. How do you actually cultivate it, though, is the next question. Because what you can do is you can put yourself in difficult situations in order to have something to bounce back from, but it's just not something that many individuals or organizations are going to actively seek out. You don't seek the pain in order necessarily to get the gain, especially when you're going to have such catastrophic consequences. You can do the Wim Hof method, if anyone's heard of that. So you can practice your breathing exercises and then submerging yourself in cold water every day for 90 seconds. I don't fancy it myself. That actually helps build resilience to the cold through practicing that. But what I have got instead is 3 points that are kind of interrelated that hopefully build up into more of a big idea. So the first one is constructive feedback. So this is fundamentally, I think, the work of a designer in a sort of functional, usable way. It's about seeking feedback from users, from colleagues, from peers, and getting that feedback and the critique. And through doing that, you'll become much more resilient, more open, and ultimately, I think, a better designer. Because otherwise, what happens is you kind of wrap yourself up in cotton wool a little bit. It's like babies who are brought up in a very clinical environment and then exposed to a nursery, where they're going to get ill anyway, but they're exposed to all sorts of bugs and bacteria, and they just pick up everything because they haven't been exposed to the dirt and they haven't built their immune system up beforehand. And I think it's a bit like that. I think if you approach your design career by being very open and asking for feedback, you will gain resilience over time, and you start to appreciate, I think, when people give you criticism rather than feel it is like a devastating insult. Of course, it does also need to be balanced with positive feedback every now and then, which inevitably you'll get. I mean, otherwise you'll just be permanently crushed. For an organization, I think it's more about being in touch with the market and about being in touch with reality. So you'll stand a better chance of bouncing back from setbacks if you do market research, if you do product research, if you do exploratory research, and through developing and cultivating an innovative mindset and adjusting processes that allow you to test and learn. So like with individuals, it's about learning, not done through ivory tower thinking, closed minds. It's about getting there and getting out there and really exploring things. So getting closer to your users, your customers, increasing your understanding of the marketplace and of your competitors. And by doing that, when things come along, you should be able, or you'll be in a better position to pivot and to make informed decisions that help you to overcome setbacks. And what that does is it builds up to a more of a system level, bigger idea, which applies equally to individuals and organizations. So resilience arises from feedback loops that can work in different ways to restore a system after a large setback. So your body, when you get an illness, becomes stronger as a result of creating antibodies. And you've got many different systems, and each of them has got different feedback loops with positive and negative feedback cycles, and they all work together to produce complex behavior. So that gives everyone a number of ways of thinking and acting that allows people to absorb shocks and recover, which is the key to being resilient. So not being overly affected by a single event. And you can see what happens when multiple systems are overloaded in this sense, and the ability to become to be resilient is compromised. So mountaineering is really interesting for this reason, because the high altitude compromises pretty much all systems. In the death zone, as it's called, above 8,000 meters, it's really difficult to process nutrients. So eating, even having condensed milk, it just doesn't happen much. And your ability to break down food and drink and things and actually absorb it and use it doesn't happen as much. Your muscles start to break down, as do your major organs. Breathing is really difficult due to the altitude, which then helps to bring on that breaking down of systems. And it also seriously compromises your thinking and all your other systems. And incidentally, in 1950, they also smoked at various points when they're on the mountain, which is just bizarre. But anyway, this systems approach encourages a holistic approach to feedback loops. So it's slightly different to receiving feedback in a work context, but it could be related. But it's the idea that your work doesn't exist in a vacuum, and you've got a million other pressures going on, and it all affects your ability to be resilient, and it all affects your reaction or your response when something seemingly small happens. When you're feeling good and all of your feedback mechanisms and everything is all in one place, and you feel very resilient, you won't absolutely lose it when someone does something really small. But there could be a number of things going on that are outside work that affects your reaction and your resilience when you're then at work. And it's also worth thinking about major disasters as well, because this ties into it as well. So if you think about each system as a bit of a slice of Swiss cheese with holes in it, when you slap together lots of them, you shouldn't really see any holes that go right through the whole block. But when there's a serious disaster, like a plane crash or something like that, it's normally the result of several systems failing and the resilience ultimately being compromised. And that's when all the holes line up and you get an arrow that goes right through it, the Swiss cheese model. But it's a way of thinking about resilience that's so much greater than how you are in a particular context. It's about thinking about the whole lot of it. And you can see, actually, if you think about how you've got on over the last year and the effect of what's gone on with the pandemic and how that might have affected you in really strange ways, and how it might have affected your resilience in ways that you just didn't imagine it could. So this is just a really nice picture of Annapurna, and I thought I'd put up there. Resilience. So resilience enabled Disney to produce some of the biggest films that you've seen and loved. At Mensa, we do this vote thing where we put it's like a table, like a cup, so it goes down in stages. You have head-to-heads, and it's like your favorite cakes or sweets or whatever. And we did Disney films, and it was really controversial because there were so many films to choose from, and the list is just massive. But it's not just films that Disney does. They've got theme parks. They own ABC, which runs National Geographic and ESPN. More significantly, they've got streaming services at Disney Plus, which has got nearly 90 million subscribers, all fitting within the mission. And the one thing that's sort of guaranteed is change. So for any organization, the best way is to keep in touch with reality so that they're able to respond, supported by capability, having the skill set to do it, and then collaboration. And Disney's now worth about $130 billion. So they're doing all right, at least on that metric. And I think that, at least some of that is down to resilience. For Herzog and Lachenal, the 2-week retreat getting off Annapurna was horrific. So in the book that Herzog wrote about the trip, he talks about how he lost his gloves near the summit on the way back down, put them on top of his rucksack, and then he watched as they fell off and tumbled down the mountain. which was a huge problem. But he had actually packed some spare socks for this eventuality. He just completely forgot to use them. And then as they were coming down, they met two more team members coming up to help them. And all four of them went down to try and find camp. The storm came in, they couldn't find camp. They fell down a crevasse and they spent the night bivouacked in the open, well, pretty much in the open, one sleeping bag between four of them. They got severe frostbite. They got gangrene later on when they came down, and the expedition doctor was performing emergency amputations. So both summit climbers lost all their toes, and Herzog lost most of his fingers. And Annapurna wasn't even climbed again until 1970. So it just goes to show you how difficult it was, firstly to get up there, and then to put up with everything afterwards. And so just to finish off, I just wanted to kind of put together my final sort of takeaway, if you like, and put it into a neat list. So I think the first thing is to think about resilience holistically. So you've got many systems affecting how you think and act. They're all interdependent. Second one is to consider the factors that cultivate resilience. So perhaps you can't become more humorous, maybe, but you can develop a mission or a purpose. You can be open-minded and seek out feedback. And then the third one is to think about the interplay between you as the individual and your employer, the organization, or your team. Because I did wonder about the examples that I've got here and whether they were the right ones, but the Annapurna climb is riddled with resilience. And actually, it was through that example that I learned about the interplay between the individual and organizational resilience. So I think that the organization may survive individuals who are not resilient, but in smaller teams, it just wouldn't have happened. So on that climb, it wasn't just that Herzog and Lachenau had this amazing personal resilience. It was also that everyone in their team did. And if anyone didn't display that resilience, it could easily have brought down the whole endeavor. So your collective resilience might be compromised when you're in small teams by individuals not being resilient, but you might not feel it as much in a large organization. So in sports teams, you might have a star player who perhaps isn't resilient, and that could then lead to the downfall or make your team less resilient. In Disney, given it's so big, individual resilience probably doesn't play in too much to the resilience of the entire organization. And so my conclusion is that it's down to individuals to reflect and being resilient as they possibly can be. And it's through that you and then your teams can subsequently become more resilient, about channeling your inner partridge and remembering that if he can bounce back, although arguably he didn't, then you can too. And then becoming more resilient becomes like this superpower. At the end of the Annapurna book, which I have here, he has this line, which is that there are other Annapurnas in the lives of people. And it's quite a stirring line. It sort of made me think, and I hope it makes you think about what it is out there that's there for you to achieve and what your Annapurnas might be. And then maybe you can think about how you're going to develop the resilience to do it, because it's probably not going to be easy and there's going to be loads of setbacks on the way. And hopefully this talk is enough to at least get you on the way to base camp. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. I always absolutely love your presentations. And you also get extra kudos from me for mentioning Alan Partridge. For everyone watching, please submit your questions using the Q&A box. But first off, Joe, I know you mentioned the Annapurna book, but I mean, what kind of started you thinking about kind of resilience in relation to design?
So we, as you know, do a thing at the Mensa, which is every Friday we send out kind of newsletter, and it's got various bits and pieces in it. But from last year, we started doing interviews with people. And one of the questions was, what's your favorite characteristic in people? I think it is. And my answer to that was resilience. And I said, it's because I don't think I've got a lot of it, but I really admire it in other people. And that was the first time really that I don't know where that answer really came from. And I don't know what I hadn't really thought of resilience that openly before, until I said it, so it must have come from somewhere. I guess it was probably from the mountaineering things, and that just led me then to exploring it more and more, until I came to organizational resilience, and then started to really develop it and think about actually how it applies to the things that we do every day. So that was the genesis of it. I was kind of inspired by myself.
No, I think that's a really good answer. I mean, it's it is really interesting to think, how, obviously, especially kind of during this pandemic, like kind of seeing organizational resilience in action, really.
Yeah, there's and because the individual resilience, there's, I mean, obviously people going through some really tough times, and so you see and hear a lot about some of the stuff that people are going through, so that's obviously a factor as well. And then of course you see how certain organizations manage to sort of make it work. I know a lot of it's luck, in the sense that you happen to be working in the sector, but it's also about organizations pivoting, and the ones who have done really well, who have kind of, especially food outlets and things like that, have managed to pivot really quickly to delivery, and breweries who relied on people coming through the door all of a sudden are doing delivery of cases and things like that, which I think is a demonstration of resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. We have one question that's come in by the Q&A box, from an anonymous attendee, who asks, do you believe that there is an ethical or moral basis to resilience, as in like there is with stoicism?
Gosh, I have no idea. There could be. I would have to think about it. That's a very heavy question. It's a good question, but I don't off the top of my head, I don't have an answer to
it. We have another question here from Tom, who says, you touched on resilience in sports teams. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, because once you start thinking about resilience and you start applying it to various other bits and pieces, if you look at what's happened with various sports teams, it's quite interesting to see how they've managed it. And that actually, it was through looking at, I don't want to bore people by talking about football, but looking at what happened to Liverpool when they got to a Champions League final and then lost it, and then managed to come back the next year and win it. That year also coming really close to the Premier League, and then the next year coming back to win it. That showed an awful lot of resilience. But then, of course, what's happened subsequently is that they've completely gone off the boil. And so that's made me think about, well, what is it then about resilience? And that was what made me think, actually, that I wonder whether there's something in the mission there that's not doing enough to motivate people. And there's a whole load of other factors to do with injuries and whatnot. But it did make me think about the interplay between the individual and whether some of the players actually aren't reacting very well, and subsequently that's affecting the whole team. So that was part of how I got to the individual and organizational resilience interplay bit. And then if you compare them to what's happened with, say, Mercedes and Formula One, and how they just keep, even though they've had many setbacks as well, and how they keep going, they won 7 years in a row. It's really interesting to look at. I think when you start applying resilience or thinking about it to smaller teams rather than massive organizations.
Nice, thanks, Joe. Got a question here from we got quite a few. Got a question here from Matt. Hi, Matt. Who's asking, do you think resilience is essential in positive health outcomes, or could that just be simply down to genetics?
I imagine that I hope that there's some really good scientific studies out there that have looked at this. I would I mean, anecdotally, you've seen stories and things like that, and this isn't an expert area of mine at all. You see anecdotal stories about positive thinking and people's attitudes and their mission have an impact on health outcomes. Certainly one thing that you hear a lot is when people have a very driven mission to get to a certain time, like with a terminal illness, you know, people who are like, I want to be at my daughter's wedding or whatever, and then they make it and then they pass away afterwards. So I think there's probably some relationship there, but as to what and how deep, I wouldn't like to say. Everything I would say would be very sort of anecdotal, but it's interesting, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joe. We've probably got time for a couple more. So we've got a question here. How can organisations set up safe cultures that support constructive feedback?
Safe cultures that support constructive feedback. So I think there has to be, it probably takes quite a long time. I mean, certainly when you're making cultural change, but there has to be a sort of no blame culture, because what you don't want to do is get to a point where you're giving feedback but thinking there's going to be some massive repercussion off the back of that. And that will stop you actually giving constructive criticism if you think that, you know, it's going to end up with you being thought of negatively, or it's going to have some impact to someone's career. So it's probably a case of getting started and modeling the behavior and building it up over time, and having things like having meetings and critiques, and getting people on board with the idea that it's okay to critique things, because you're trying to get to a better place off the back of it. So it's the outcome that you're looking for. And then of course there's a load of other stuff around you know, making sure that your critiques and your criticism things aren't personal, and that you're actually commenting on specific things that have happened rather than, you know, making it about the individual. So there's a whole host of hygiene things around it. And then I think beyond that, it's about really encouraging it and modeling it and building it up over time. And I think it's having the tools as well and the mechanisms to support it. So that might be setting up the right meetings, where you've given people forums to say things. It's kind of a safe space where people can feel that they can speak and not be attacked. We've also got a tool at Nemensa that we've started to use relatively recently that works really nicely for feedback. So you can ask people for feedback. And I think that plays into the kind of the cultural element, because it's something that is actively encouraged to do and built into people's goals and things like that.
Great, thanks, Joe. I think we've got time for one more. So I have a question here. How can small, resilient teams affect an organisation if they feel the current direction or value of the business are not on the same wavelength?
Yeah. I think the resilience part of that is the ability for that team to maintain its mission and keep going. I think the ability, I don't know whether them being resilient in themselves, because what we're talking about there is almost transformation and influencing people higher up. I think one thing it will do is that if you've got a small resilient team who are slightly at odds with the direction of the organization, as long as you're resilient and you're tied in and built into that mission, you will be able to keep going and keep persisting. And through time, you will start to perhaps have an influence, or you'll be able to keep chipping away at trying to have an influence. I think that's a little bit what I was mentioning about, like, it might be for a really long haul that you're in there for, and that resilience will help you keep going and doing the things that you think are right, and accepting that actually that's quite a hard thing to do, and it will probably take quite a lot of time. I don't know if I've really answered that, but I can think about it some more. I think I know who asked.
That's awesome. Thanks, Joe. I know That's just about all we have time for, I'm afraid. I know there's a few unanswered questions, but I'm sure people can get in touch with you on Twitter, Joe.
Yeah, yeah. People, yeah, absolutely. Feel free to drop me a note on Twitter or contact me on LinkedIn or however you like. I think it's difficult with some of the questions because this is kind of like it's a bit like when I did the stoicism thing. It's kind of like a big mindset thing, and I think people inevitably think, well, how can this apply to my specific situation? And sometimes on the spot, it's quite difficult to answer and to think that through. But yeah, if you contact me, we can definitely talk about it, and I will probably come up with something a lot more coherent.
Awesome, brilliant. Well, no, thank you so much, Joe. That was a brilliant presentation. Thank you to everyone else that tuned in. As I said, yeah, we'll send the recording over as soon as we can once that's ready. Please also join us for our next webinar, which is going to be hosted by Chris Richards, Momensa's creative director. And that's going to be on 13th of April. We're going to be releasing details on this in the next few days. So just keep your eyes peeled for that. I hope everyone enjoyed. Again, thank you to Joe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.